I'm Matt Wilhelmi. I'm the owner of Strategic Voyages Business Consultants. I'm also the author of Taboo Business Questions, What's Haunting Every Entrepreneur's Growth. And I'm joined by Lindsay Rios. She is a fractional revenue and growth leader specializing in early stage SaaS companies. Been doing it for a while now, I think over 10 years by our last count. But Lindsay, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
In this second episode, I'm really excited to kind of hear some of these different cautionary tales. And I wanted to kind of set the stage a little bit because I did have somebody ask me once, Matt, why are you talking about cautionary tales? Well, I think the answer is pretty obvious, but if there was a question, it serves asking and then answering, which is basically not everybody takes our advice. I know this might be kind of hard for people to realize, but some people don't like what we have to say. Maybe they do it too slowly, or they want to do it on their own, and that's their prerogative. But then I think it's interesting also to kind of be able to follow that story or understand kind of what happens. And so that's exactly what we're doing today. Lindsay's got a couple of cautionary tales. I've got one as well, but her first one that she said she wanted to share with you guys is about this startup that said yes to everything. Lindsay, can you tell me more about that one?
Yeah. And actually, there wasn't just one startup that I've worked with that said yes to everything. So this should feel like I'm kind of preaching to the choir, I'm sure, for a lot of people out there. But, this particular one, was early stage, as I focus on, and had a really great, proof of concept product and a lot of great validation within the market, that this was needed, this was wanted, and it was really in the enterprise space that this was validated in. And they, brought me in to help build an enterprise sales process and grow it, an enterprise business. And one of the things that I started noticing really quickly when I started working there was, here I am building out a playbook and starting an enterprise sales process, but then learning that they were trying to launch a freemium model at the same time. And I paused there and I was like, well, why? Why do we want to do that at the exact same time? That is a completely different sales motion and go-to-market strategy and resources and thought process, et cetera, right? And
so Lindsay, did you feel like maybe they were going to confuse their audience with different messaging?
I mean, yes. My brain was like binging all around because I was like, oh my God, why are we doing that? I mean, it wasn't just because of confused messaging. It was also a resource issue, in my opinion, right? And so early stage, you're always resource constrained. Always, right? And I'm thinking, how are we going to put even just engineering resources into creating a freemium model if we're supposed to be doing an enterprise model? And they're complete opposite ends of the spectrum here. And I just started by asking why, because I'm new, right? There's some plan that's been created before I started. Catch me up here. It wasn't some crazy thought out thing. I wasn't interrupting something that they'd been building on for, months and months. So that was the good news. But it was simple as, we just figured if we have some free signups, then people will, come in and then, maybe get the kind of cheapest tier and we'll just get some revenue that way easily. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to burst a bubble, but it doesn't work like that. You can't just have, it's not a whole just because you build it, they will come type of approach here. And that was kind of my first red flag of they want to just kind of do a little bit of everything here. But it wasn't just that, it was just saying yes to any feature request. Can you do this? Yeah, we could do that. What?
That sounds like a huge red flag. I mean, you're talking about taking your developers off of their own timeline, right? And then just like throwing random requests at them instead of maybe having like a more strategic rollout. Is that something you get involved with often with your clients, or is this, it is? Okay.
Yeah. So I think a big part of what I do, and actually I was just on the phone with someone yesterday who wants to get into consulting now and fractional work. And I said, what I really specialize in is these early stage companies that either are transitioning from a PLG motion to, a sales assisted motion, and or we've been inbound and word of mouth, and we now need to go outbound. And she just kind of laughed. She goes, oh, so you like to help with one of the most difficult points in a company ever. And I started laughing and I went, I suppose I do. I guess that is what I like specializing in. I'm one of those crazy people. But this was it. This was that moment of like, hey, we can't be PLG but also be sales assisted at the same time. We can't build a strategic roadmap that aligns with business goals by doing both of those things. And so I think one of the biggest things that I focus on at the companies I work with is how to align product strategy and business strategy, because that is one of those tensions you're going to get kind of forever. And if you can't figure out how to get those two things aligned, you see these companies that fail, that had an awesome product, or were going great for a while, or you just see companies start to really lose their stride, and lose that hyper growth they maybe once had.
Yeah, I think about some of the folks that I've worked with in organizations that do something similar to what you do, or even the exact same work that you do, and it always amazes me at the analytics behind it, because there should be a tremendous amount of data that you're gathering from this process. Like, this should not be a surprise that I am, as the CFO, typically, that's the hat that I wear. I want to know some of these things. What is the average cost to acquire a client? If we have absolutely no idea, that's a problem. And if we've got two very different strategies with two very different revenue models, it's almost like you're running two totally different companies. And the CFO is probably scratching his head or her head and just kind of wondering, like, why? We're not even good at one of them. What makes you think we'd be good at two of them, right?
Yep. Yeah. It kind of reminds me of that phrase, kind of, what is it, like master, what is it? Something of something and master of none.
I don't know.
Gosh, I'm sorry. I can't remember what it is, but yeah, you can't do a little bit of everything, when you're trying to, especially when you're trying to launch a company, right? You got to do something really, really well. And then learn from that. And then you can try to, expand from there. But that was just the theme, at this company. It was just, if we say yes to everything, we'll just figure it out. Right.
Yeah. I think the phrase you're looking for is jack of all trades, master of none.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I think it's important for startups to really kind of remember, because they haven't quite figured out a lot. And there's a lot of like nervous excitement, but you have to have things documented, and you have to have things kind of in place and proven, so that you have a foundation to then build off of, instead of kind of splitting your resources right down the middle.
Yeah.
Just sounds like a chaotic environment. Well, Lindsay, I wanted to tell you about this SaaS company that had stagnant revenue growth, because I bet you've met companies like this who don't know why the revenue's not growing. They can show you they're acquiring new clients. They can show you the lifetime value of the client, and it's all very pretty charts, and they've got their software, totally dialed in. And even their CFO sometimes is like, I can't figure out why, and it's like, okay, well, if we pull the curtain back a little bit, maybe we can figure it out. And so in this particular story of this company that I worked with, I did start to ask some of the same questions that you did, because it didn't make sense. You should not have stagnant revenue if you're bringing on the number of clients that they were bringing on and charging money. These are not like free clients. And so kind of very obviously, I just asked, like, hey, like, how long are these clients staying on? And I was assured that they don't have any dropout. They're like, oh, our retention rate's in the 90s. Everything is great. We don't ever lose clients. And I was like, okay, so you don't ever lose clients. First of all, I find that hard to believe.
Yeah.
That's just like, yeah, are we really being truthful here? Are the spidey senses going off at all? But then, the next question I asked was like, well, of that maybe super small percentage that does drop off, like, where is that in your model? And the person who was wearing the CFO hat before I got there had no answer, and was really kind of like, well, it's baked in, it's factored into this other tab. And kind of got nervous and then, tried really quickly to change the subject. And so I wasn't trying to like put this person off, but you do have to kind of account for churn. And if you're trying to build a company and you don't understand the amount of money it takes you to acquire a client relative to the amount of value that that client brings long-term, you're not building a sustainable business because you don't have some of those basic things figured out. And so what I was able to do with that company is kind of maybe show them that their chief finance person wasn't maybe the best person for the job. But more important than that, really kind of identifying, well, actually you do have churn and you don't even know how bad that problem is. And so if you keep pumping money into marketing and you keep pumping money into sales, or you keep turning over your chief salespeople without really solving that back end problem, you're not ever going to solve the problem. And so that was really interesting kind of exercise to go through with them, because after that, they wanted me to talk to them about, lifetime value and maybe mapping out a customer journey. It sounds like a lot of the things that you do, when you're working with companies, because you do have to identify where that drop off is. Do they agree and then they quit within 30 days? Because that's probably maybe one set of issues. Do they agree to your software and they drop off after 90 days? Is it after 3 years? Like, what is the timeline? Because then you can maybe interject some value to keep that customer on board.
Yeah, I love that you dug into the churn thing too. That's definitely a question I always ask when I'm, working with companies. And I think people get a little, like you said, they got really like nervous, right? And they're like, oh, we don't have that. It's like, there's nothing wrong with having that. I just want to know all about it, because there's so much to learn from that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's Kevin O'Leary on Shark Tank who very famously said he's never seen projections he doesn't like. And it's very easy to create projections that look fancy and everything's pointing up in the correct direction when you have no attrition. But that's just not reality. If we're in the software space, everybody's canceling their software at some point. Right. It's just a matter of when. And so we really need to kind of dial into that. And so you mentioned that I asked some of those questions, Lindsay. I mean, I'm not, I might ask the question just because I know that there's an answer out there, but I'm not necessarily the one that's going to fix it. And so I hope that that's, where you're going to be able to come in with your skill set and really be able to solve some of those problems. I'm on the customer evolution, or the customer journey, I should say, side of the house. I'm much more just interested in the kind of the finances of it. I think that there's a great need for your services, which is to kind of solve some of those problems. So I do think that we could work well together, on some of these projects. But all that to say, I'm curious about your second cautionary tale. In your first one, you were, in the first one, it was the founder, or the startup, I should say, that said yes to everything. I think a lot of us in the consulting world could probably relate to that. But then you also mentioned there's this other one where maybe the founder won't let go of sales. Does that happen a lot? Do you see that often?
I mean, I think anyone watching this is probably like either shouting at the screen right now of like, that's where I'm at, right? I'm in the middle of that, or it's probably one of the most common cautionary tales in startup land, for sure. And I think a lot of founders, even going into it, probably try to say things like, that'll never be me. And then it is. And it's understandable. Actually, when I was watching one of your other sessions, this was being discussed a little bit too. These founders put their absolute, love and life and passion into creating and launching a company, right? And so they have this vision and they want to see it through. And so they're going to have a very different attachment to the outcome of this company than anyone else, And so, having that empathy is important, but it also is a real problem, at a lot of companies where a lot of, revenue first comes from a founder. This is going back to the case study that we were talking about. Hey, I have this great network and I have a lot of pull. I'm awesome. I have a lot of influence and I have this great company. So people go, I'll have a look at what you're doing. Anything for you, friend, right? And again, that doesn't go into real qualification, probably, but also then it turns into a different expectation that founder has had when they did the selling, to now when it's time to hand it over to either a sales leader or a salesperson, and they can't seem to step away and let that person, that new sales pro, do what they do best, And so most of these founders, and in this one in particular, was smart enough to know I don't have a background in selling. I don't have a background in selling, and I don't have a background in sales leadership. So I know I need to go get someone who does. And I want them to help now make this business that I've started and gained impactful revenue, built some sort of a business here, and I want them to take it to the next level. And then they literally won't stop being involved in the process. They won't stop asking 500 questions, about everything that person is doing. And it really, it's going to completely keep that business from properly growing, because you're blocking that either sales, it doesn't matter if it's a sales leader or like a great salesperson that you hire as that first sales hire, you're blocking them from doing the parts that they do know how to do. And it's very fear-based, right? They're so afraid that what they've created and started is now either going to fail or not continue the trajectory that they've had. And so they're so afraid of mistakes and the wrong direction. And yet you have to, I think as a founder, and something I've said before to founders like this is, you were terrified when you started this, right? You had no idea if this was going to work. What you created is probably not even the thing that you've been selling. That's never going to go away. You're going to continue to validate. You're going to continue to experiment and make mistakes, but you're smart enough to know, one, this is not your expertise. And two, you need to build people around you that can help you with this. So go back to that thought process, right? Because otherwise what you see is attrition in the company, right? Sales leaders either getting forced out or leave on their own, or the AEs, because they're like, this founder will not get out of my business. They won't let me do what I do. They can't hit the targets, which might not even be very realistic in the first place. And when they try to give that feedback, you talked a lot about when people don't want to take our advice, right? They don't really want to hear it. They just think, well, I've done this. I know what this looks like. I've been able to sell it. Why can't you? You're the problem, not me, or not the product or the market or whatever other variables that exist. So I think in my experience, over the decade I've been doing this, is, when you start to get that level of confidence to be able to push back and say, hey, I have empathy for you. I understand where you're coming from, but we need to be okay with making some mistakes and doing some experimentation here. But I also need you to trust me a little bit more. And if you don't get that response back, right, of okay, right, then you might be having a big red flag here that's going to continue on. But hopefully, there's more and more founders out there who will be like this, who will not let go of sales process, that get someone who has been able to come in with enough experience to tell them that kind of message. And then they finally are going, okay, let me try that. Let me let go.
Well, Lindsay, I think that's an interesting story, because I can relate with some of the clients that I've worked with. And, I'm much more on the process side than I am on the gut side. When you're talking about letting go of sales, I would guess that there's an emotionality to it. You mentioned the word fear, which is kind of where that emotionality probably comes from. But if there's a sales process and you're trusting the process, not the person, then hopefully there's more confidence, because then you should have metrics at each juncture or wherever you want in the milestones of your customer journey to be able to say, well, traditionally 30% converted from this step to this step. And then traditionally of those 10% converted from this step to this. And so, but if you don't have any of those metrics, right, and you haven't built that funnel, you don't know what the process is, I can totally relate to it being like an anxious ball of energy, because you're handing over your baby to somebody that maybe doesn't really have a distinct process that they're following. And so that is a very nerve-wracking place for a founder to be. And I'm assuming that you've dealt with this a number of times. And so it sounds like your soft skills are very in tune with being able to relate to the emotionality and the empathy that you mentioned, because that's an important piece of the job. This is not, if 1 + 1 always equaled 2, I think that our jobs would be a lot easier, but sometimes there does need to be a little bit more hand-holding or just kind of relating and saying, hey, like, I know this is kind of scary for you. The worst thing that could happen is not going to happen. We're going to put some guardrails in place. Please trust me with this process because it will never, ever grow if you don't try. And
Right.
so that's really interesting that was your story, because I can absolutely relate.
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point, it's I didn't, dig into the process part, but yeah, you absolutely need to come with a good plan, right? A good strategy and process and a well thought out thing to present to them as to what you're going to do and why. Sadly, there are still these founders who are like, that's not the way we should do it, right? The way I've been doing it's the way to do it.
There's also founders that I've met that are on the other side of that coin. There's the ones that you're talking about, which like hold on to it so tight, right? And like, I'm never going to let go of sales. And then there's the other ones that are like, oh, you're a sales guy? Here you go. I don't want anything to do with it. I don't want to know anything. And then, 9 months later, they're like, why don't we have any sales? It's like, well, but you didn't set them up for success. They have no training. They have no guidance. You didn't even give them like a value proposition statement. They have nothing. And so what did you think was going to happen? And so you don't want to go that far into the delegation world of like totally hands off. You do have to kind of balance it a little bit, right?
Yeah. And that's one thing that, I put the part in the accountability that I put on the founder when it comes to the time where they are going to kind of relinquish sales to another person is you still need to know what are the things that what are those guardrails, right? You talked about what are those minimum KPIs that I should be monitoring to know that they're doing the right things here, even if, there can be mistakes, right? But they're doing the right things, because you're totally right too. You've seen so many of those founders who go, you're an awesome salesperson or sales leader. Here you go. I relinquish all power and you go for it. And then it's too much autonomy and freedom. And then 9 months later, nothing's happened. And then usually those are the leaders that get let go, right? And then you're like, you don't learn much from it, and it's a bummer.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to think about these cautionary tales from that viewpoint of what's the worst thing that could happen. You waste a bunch of money and a bunch of time. Hopefully you're not damaging your reputation. Of course, that is a possibility on the table. But if you put these guardrails in place, if you put these checkpoints in the process, like your point was, Lindsay, you're able to, as a founder, have some confidence that things won't get messed up too bad. And
Right.
You'll be able to kind of follow it along and understand, your risk tolerance associated with the sales process. I just think it's a really important lesson to kind of reiterate, because when we're talking about these cautionary tales, I think unfortunately sometimes founders find themselves in a place where maybe they don't think that anyone else has ever dealt with these things before, or they find themselves thinking that they're so isolated they don't even know what questions to ask, and so then they just get kind of frozen with fear. I'm hopeful that through kind of telling some of these stories, that these founders can find folks like you to ask some of these questions to, and maybe get a little bit more confidence in kind of moving forward. And so for people that are watching this episode, I just wanted to say thank you for getting to this part. Lindsay is bringing a tremendous amount of her experience to the table. She's a fractional revenue and growth leader specializing in early stage SaaS companies, and brings over a decade of experience to the table and the conversation with cautionary tales. So I hope everybody stays tuned for our third episode. That's the one where Lindsay and I are going to present some solutions to our case study that we unpacked in episode number 1. Stay tuned.